Let's take a closer look at a key piece of kit in any woodworker's shop. The mitre saw, sometimes called a chop saw. And this version here is a sliding compound miter saw. So let's take a look at this and talk about some tips and tricks that you might not have heard of. Most miter saws nowadays come with a work light and a laser. We can see on this Metabo we've got both, the work light on the left hand side and the laser on the top. This really helps illuminate in workshops where you might have slightly offset lighting, things might not be quite bright enough. So having both the work light and the laser really help. Here you can see I've darkened the room a little bit and you can see the laser leaving a nice mark on the board. This is really excellent to help you ensure that you're going to make nice accurate cuts right on your pencil mark. So take a look at this. You can see how close this blade gets to the laser mark. Sometimes the lasers can be a little bit misaligned. It's usually not too difficult to get them lined up. But again, you can see here in this example just how accurate this is. Really helps when you're trying to make cuts exactly where you want them and exactly where you expect them to be. Now, although these are sometimes called chop saws, they're really better called mitre saws. And in this example here, we have a mitre gauge that goes both to the left and the right. And I'm doing this at the moment using the locking lever in the center of the mitre saw. Now this locking lever is important to allow you to set the angle of your mitres. And this particular model, it's very easy. You just simply twist it to loosen it, then push down the red lever and you can move it left or right. Now on decent mitre saws, you typically have a gauge going from 0 to 45 or sometimes beyond 45, and they have positive stops or detents along the way. So that means when you get to 15, 22.5 and so on, it kind of bumps into place, so it gives you a positive stop at those particular points. That's very useful if you're making repeatable cuts. Let's say you want to do repeatable cuts at 30 degrees. That will set this cut line at the 30-degree mark over and over again. Now again, these can sometimes be a little bit misaligned, but most mitre saws have a mechanism to make it fairly easy to recalibrate these. So these are all the positive stops going all the way up to 45. Now this mitre saw goes a little bit beyond 45, but using this particular saw you're not really going to get much use out of that because it just gets a little bit difficult to understand what particular degree you're cutting at. And again, this saw goes from 0 to 45 on both sides. Now I'll cut a little sample piece of wood. Again, you can see the laser giving us a nice accurate mark. So I'm going to cut this fully at the 45-degree mark. And this is a classic, probably one of the most common cuts you'll do with a mitre saw. And the reason why you might make this type of cut, one classic use case is in building a picture frame, for example. So here's a little mock-up. We cut a 45 on one side, 45 on another. We get a perfect 90-degree angle with a 45 mitre on each side. A popular function on a lot of mitre saws nowadays is a sliding function. This allows you to slide the head of the blade forward and back. You can then lock it back in place and the saw is firmly fixed in whatever position you need it to be. Now with this sliding mechanism, it allows you to cut much wider boards. So you can see in this example, we get all the way out to about 12 inches. So that means we can cut a board of approximately that width with this mitre saw. Here's an example on a piece of OSB scrap wood. So you can see no problem, we're well beyond the width of the board here. And if we had a mitre saw that did not have the sliding mechanism, we'd be limited to the width of the blade. So again, in this example, no problem. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that you need a little bit more workspace sometimes, depending on the design of your mitre saw. But you need some more space to allow the mechanism to go back. In this example, this particular mitre saw has a nice cable design mechanism, keeping everything nice and tidy. Blade size is also important. With this saw at 90 degrees we've got a cutting capacity of 12 inches. You should also keep an eye on the type of blade guard that you want. This is a critical safety device. Another piece of functionality, and in my opinion mandatory piece of functionality on a miter saw, is trench stop. This allows you to stop how deep the saw blade will cut through a piece of wood. So in this saw it's really simple. You just slide the little blocking piece of metal forward or back, and when it's forward it will stop this little bolt from allowing the blade to go down too deep. So you can set it to whatever depth you need. There's a little scale on the side which I don't use. I'd prefer to eyeball the halfway point through a piece of wood. So in this example I'm going to cut halfway through two equal pieces of timber. This creates a really strong joint, in this case called a half lap joint. So here are the two pieces of timber, both of them cut halfway through, and you can see when you put them together you get a really strong joint. Again, this is called a half lap joint. So next up we have the bevel function on your miter saw. So you can see at the back of this miter saw we have a locking mechanism where you can move from a 0 degrees bevel up to 45 degrees. There's no positive stops on this particular model, so you have to really check that you're accurate if you want to do something between 0 and 45. Here's a different angle to show what it looks like when we tilt it over. This is a fairly big miter saw, relatively heavy, so it's handy to have a couple of grips to be able to pull it back when it's tilted over. Let's do a few example cuts. So the first cut is a simple 0 degree chop type cut. Now let's move the table over to 45 degrees. We'll give ourselves a 45 degree mitre cut. Okay, great. Let's get rid of this scrap piece. Now we've tilted it over on a bevel. So we've still got the 45 degree, but now we're doing a bevel. So that's why this is sometimes called a compound miter saw, because you're mixing two different angles together. So here are the three pieces cut side by side. You've got a 90 degree chop cut, you've got a 45 degree cut, you've got a compound bevel and mitre cut. So if mobility is important to you, make sure there's a mechanism to be able to lock down the sliding functionality and also the head of the saw, and that you've got decent carry handles. In my case it's all bolted down, but mobility might be important to you. Now all miter saws will have a fence at the back. Mine even comes with a little nick where I cut into it myself. And they'll sometimes have extendable base plates or tables that you can extend out. This one has a fairly crappy kind of stop block mechanism at the end. You can see it wiggles around a lot, so it's really unreliable for making repeated cuts. So what I like to do for this is get a clamp and a stop block. You can see this stop block has a secret little chamfer cut. I'll show you what that's for in a second. So just clamp this on wherever you like your pieces of wood to end, and then you can make repeated cuts all day long, and these cuts will be identical. Cool, nice cuts. Now that little chamfer on the stop block was to let sawdust get pushed underneath. Easy. So as you might have picked up, if you set your miter saw at 0 degrees, you actually make a 90 degree cut across your piece of wood. You should get a perfect right angle. Here's a little demo, kind of redundant, but just want to make this point. So at 0 degrees you get a 90 degree cut. Now if our miter saw maxes out at 45 degrees, how do you cut more than a 45 degree cut? Well, here's one little hack. It's a bit sketchy. You can take a piece of scrap wood that you've cut a 30 degree cut in, clamp that down, and then hold your workpiece up to that. So 90 minus 30 equals 60. So this sketchy kind of cut, and it's sketchy because it's hard to hold, this sketchy kind of cut gives you a nice 60 degrees. Let's just test it here with the angle finder. Okay, 60. Now, we can do something a bit better and a bit safer. So let's take some double-sided tape. This won't leave any permanent damage to your table. So let's stick this tape onto each side of the work table. And then I'm going to take a flat piece of wood. I've got some plywood that I'm going to add onto this. So remove the double-sided tape, get your piece of plywood that has one square edge at the back to marry up to your fences, and drop this in place. Now what I'm going to do with this sacrificial piece of wood is cut it 45 degrees on the left and 45 degrees on the right, and then take out the scrap piece that's in the center. Okay, so let's get the left side cut. Now the right side. Beautiful camera angle. Spielberg would be proud. Okay, so let's get rid of this centerpiece. And now when we introduce a workpiece to this, it's a little bit safer. So let's say we want to do a 75 degree cut. So that's 90 minus 15. So this is a really sharp angle. And let's cut this. So this is one technique to go beyond the 45 degree limitations of your mitre saw. So perfect. A nice 75 degree, fairly extreme cut. Simple as that, and relatively safe. Okay, so this little addition is really cool. You know when you cut really small pieces of wood, they can fall in between the slot and become a little bit dangerous? Well, what we're going to make here is 2-in-1 really. It's a zero clearance plate, but it's also an extended fence. An extended fence will really help if you want to use stop blocks that are wider than your standard fence. So take a couple of scrap pieces of MDF in this case, screw them together, make sure you sink the screw heads so they're not causing any obstruction. Try it on for size. Now on most mitre saws you have a couple of holes drilled in the back of the fence, and you can use these to secure on your extended fence. So make sure you've got some fairly short screws for this, and screw it in on the left and the right side. Then just to test things out, you can put on a sample stop block. This will give you nice long repeated cuts. And then cut through to give yourself the zero clearance that you might need. So here you have the zero clearance plate. And then when you're cutting a really thin piece of wood like this, it's not going to fall down, fly back up in your face and just jump around your workshop. It'll just blow away. So again, extended fence and much safer zero clearance gap now. Look at the old gap that we had in between before. Much better. Mitre saws can be considered a fairly dangerous tool, so protection is important. I like to use all of the above, so start off with some lung protection. I like some solid eye protection, definitely hearing protection, these are pretty loud, and sometimes even full face protection as well, depending on the pieces I'm working on. So that's it. Please like and subscribe.